Well now, hello, my name's Adrian Gilbert, and today we're going to do the second part of my little series called A Revolution in Evolution, which is going to be a fresh look at Darwinism or the theory of evolution according to Charles Darwin. Now, if you haven't already looked at part one of the series, then I recommend that you do that first before you go into this lecture. It'll make much more sense to you if you've already seen the first part, as it were. This part's going to be sort of starting to challenge the theory from a different point of view. Now, we discussed how he came up with a theory that all of life, in its many forms and variations, has developed from a common ancestor, a spontaneously generated single-cell life form. According to Darwin, the diversity of life that we see today is not the result of a creator god, but was produced by spontaneous adaptations over millions and millions of years, modified by survival of the fittest. Now, before we go on, I'm sure you're all only too familiar with the idea of Darwin, that everything is mutating according to this idea of survival of the fittest, so that according to him there are random changes that happen. Perhaps a beak gets slightly larger, or the colour of an insect's wings change slightly, and it gives them an edge in the battleground of life. Because we look at life and we see it as a battleground, the kinds of creatures that want to eat other creatures, and there are creatures that have to try to prevent themselves being eaten. So there's this ongoing tension and war between different species, and the survival of the fittest, according to Darwin, comes about through this idea of these perhaps quite minor changes, but give an edge, and so that change gets taken up and it increases, whereas the ones who didn't have that edge decrease and go extinct. And then other changes happen, and then those things go extinct, and then so gradually everything mutates and changes, survival of the fittest, till we end up with the world we see around us today, including ourselves, the human race. I mean, that is the basic principle of Darwinism. I know there's probably a lot of other add-ons to that. I'm probably being quite crude in my sort of presentation of it, but this is the basic thesis, that everything just happens, and because of competition in the marketplace, you could call it, only those creatures, which includes plants, by the way, survive that are fittest to survive. And how do we know that? Because they're the ones that survive. It's a circular argument, actually. How do you know that those are the fittest to survive? It's because they're the ones who survived. Well, was that the reason? We'll be talking about that a bit later. Now, to illustrate this, he devised a tree of life diagram whose branches symbolized the diversity of all life forms, past and present, from the original single-celled organism. This protocell was said to be ancestral to all subsequent life forms, including the human race. Now, this is a very important concept, the idea that there's a single life form. We don't know how it came about. A bunch of chemicals somehow interacted. This is how it's taught in schools today. Came about, and somehow or other they formed the first cell, and that cell then begins adapting. The first bacterium, and it gradually turns into a kind of primitive fish, and primitive animal that walks on land, and primitive birds. And the evolution goes on and on and on over millions of years, perhaps billion years or more. And we end up with what we have today. That is the principle of Darwinism, which is, I believe, treated like a kind of religion. You cannot criticize it. You cannot go up against it, because if you do, people get very angry. I'm sure if they saw my videos, they would be very angry about those. Probably they won't, because I'm not in the mainstream. But if they did, they would be very angry. And people who do criticize Darwinism, if they're academics, they can risk losing their jobs. They do. They get thrown out of universities, not allowed to teach. If a teacher in school started trying to teach against Darwinism, they would be expelled as well. So this is like a religion, and it's something that is treated as though it's a given. And I've even had, after my first lecture on this subject, someone criticized what I said. And they said, "Can't you see that it's a fact?" Well, it's not a fact, it's a theory. There's a difference between fact and theory. I could take this pen and I could drop it and it lands on my desk here. Yeah, I don't know if you can see that. Push that forwards a bit. I drop it. Now, the fact is that it drops. The theory is that it drops because of gravity, something that's pulling at it. There's an invisible field, a gravitational field, which pulls things to the center. That is not a fact. That is a theory, Newton's theory of gravitation. And you have to understand that in science, there's a difference between facts, which are observable things that you see, you record as data, and the theories, the hypotheses and theories that you develop to explain those facts. And a theory stands, you say it's plausible, usually, or it should be, because it makes predictions which then, when tested, come true. So you say, aha, that supports my theory. And the more supports you have for a theory, the more it becomes accepted as consensus. But it is never a fact. Any theory is open to challenge at any time. And that is the nature of science. And Darwin's theory of evolution is no different. It's only a theory. So understand that. Right, so I'm saying here, to illustrate this, he devised a tree of life diagram whose branches symbolize the diversity of life forms. Now you can see this tree drawn here. This is actually Darwin's own sketch that he made, perhaps on the back of a napkin or maybe in his notebook, I'm not sure. And you can see there are various branches coming out. One's at the bottom there, probably gone extinct, and then he's got some A would be an extinct one, and he's got B, C, D. Those would be kind of continuing things today. Perhaps C might be mammals, and B might be birds, and D might be, I don't know, lizards, something like that. Different branches of the same tree. Now we then examined more recent work on the DNA code. This, it is now clear, is very similar to computer code, except that instead of using binaries, ones and zeros, it makes use of chemical code. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with computers and computer systems and the way that programs are written and the way that computers work, but you've probably heard that they work on binary. And that's because within your computer is a whole array, millions actually, billions sometimes, of switches. And a switch can be in one of two positions, either be on or off. And your program tests the switch in a particular position within its memory to see if it's on or off. And from that, it can conclude, taking a bunch of switches together, whether that piece of data is an A or a B or a C or a number 3 or whatever. So that is how computers work. They work by using switches, and the switches themselves can only be in one of two positions. But in our code used in the DNA code, which in many respects is very similar to computer code, because it determines what proteins are going to be made by that cell those particular pieces. We don't understand exactly how it does all this. I mean, they understand bits and pieces of it, but we've by no means got a full picture of exactly how the genetic code works. And it's different for every species, and it's actually different for every individual. That's a very, very complicated thing. But what we do know is that there are just four structured on four nucleotide bases: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. And those are given, because of their first letters, A, G, C, and T. And the way those are arranged in the arrays within the DNA molecule determines the way that that piece of DNA is going to be used. Now, I'm not a biochemist, and I don't know a huge amount on that, but I do understand the principle, and that is that these arrays are incredibly complicated. And as I explained in the first lecture, it's very clear that they were not arrived at by chance. It takes intelligence to write a computer program. Now, I know this because I used to be a computer programmer, and believe me, it's hard work, and you have to do it absolutely exactly. You get one spell a data word wrongly, put a full stop in the wrong place or leave one out, and your program's going to crash. Yeah, or it's certainly going to throw up unexpected data and cause problems. You get bugs, as they're called. So the idea that DNA code just arises, spontaneously changes and gives you positive things which give an edge, that's rubbish. It's not going to work that way, because to have these kind of complex codes requires intelligence. Intelligence can create intelligent creations. Accidental chance doesn't do that. It's just not enough molecules in the universe. There's not enough monkeys typing out Shakespeare to give you this. And that's the arguments that are in the first lecture. Anyway, statistical probability shows that this system could not have arisen by chance. It takes intelligence to create intelligent systems, which is what this is. It's an intelligent system. Now, today we're going to look at evolution from a different perspective. Instead of examining nature, as did Darwin, we'll consider how we humans do things. After all, however flawed we may be, we ourselves are intelligent creatures. We have the ability to use our minds to create and invent. Such creations often develop an evolutionary way as we explore possibilities for the improvements of our inventions. Now, before I go on to that, I'm talking here about how we create things and then we evolve them. Now, I'm absolutely fascinated at the moment. Much to my wife's annoyance at times, I'm almost obsessed with what's going on in Boca Chica in Texas. And in case you don't know what I'm talking about, that is the place where SpaceX has set up its research and design development system factory for making what they call starships. And they're building these enormous rockets. Oh, I say they're building the rockets. At the moment, they're experimenting with building stages of the rocket that contain the tanks with the fuel, which is going to be methane, liquid methane, and liquid oxygen. I think they call it methalox, the system. And then they have an engine, a rocket engine underneath, which will mix those components together and burn them, giving an enormous pressure on the rocket. Actually, these are the most powerful engines ever built. And they launched one of these stacks. They're not full rockets yet, even. They're one of these huge stacks, taller than a big building in New York. Yeah. I'm not talking about skyscrapers, but the finished rocket, when it's done, will be taller than the Statue of Liberty, if you think about it. And with just one of these engines, they've been able to launch one of these big stacks of steel rings all joined together with the tanks inside, and to land it. Now, that has not happened by chance. Let's get that clear. Some of the most intelligent people on the planet working together alongside some really good top quality engineers have put together this system, and they're gradually evolving it. They're gradually developing it. If you see the first example they built, the first prototype, it was rubbish. But they used that. They learned from their mistakes. A few of them have blown up on the pad where they're testing out the engine, and instead of it testing out, the thing explodes. But they don't let that hold them back. They just clear away the mess and start again. And they're building another one and another, and they're gradually getting better and better. And they have a plan that they're going to go to Mars. They're going to build these rocket ships, never been seen before on this planet, and they're going to fly to Mars, and they want to go there by 2024. An insanely short period of time. But the last time we saw anything like this, I was alive for, which was in the 1960s, when the objective was to land a man on the moon. And you've all seen the pictures of Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. I know a lot of people are skeptical. They say it wasn't done, it was just filmed in a studio. Well, there are pictures, you can actually look at live footage, I think, from telescopes that show the buggies, what's left of the landers, actually on the moon's surface. And you can be sure that in time to come, those places where those first men landed are going to become tourist attractions. People will be flying to the moon just to go and have a look. I'm sure of it. So these things, these processes to develop something new like this, which is complicated, it's not simple to build a rocket. It's not simple to understand rocket science. That's why we say something's not rocket science when we mean it's easy. Rocket science is not easy, it's difficult. And it takes the best minds on the planet to pull it off. So why should we think that building a creature, even a simple single-celled animal, let's call it an animal, bacterium, whatever you want to call it, is far more complicated than anything we've built. We cannot do that. We cannot make a life form. We cannot make one that is alive for even a half a second. We can take life forms that are already there, we can adapt them, we can change them, we can modify. Yeah, we can change plants to produce better crops for us. We can modify dogs so that they'll be able to crawl down a rabbit hole or chase a wolf. We can do these things, but it has to be already there. The potential has to already be within that life form. We can't do it from scratch. So to think that such things can just happen, and I'm not talking about just adaptations, I'm talking about bringing in entirely new ideas, and that's what we're going to explore today in this lecture. As an example, we'll examine how railway locomotives have evolved over the roughly 200 years since their first invention in 1802. Now, the reason I'm choosing railway engines is that we have got, I could have done this with aeroplanes, but I've chosen railway engines because I think it's a good example of how what starts off as a technology is adapted and changed and modified, you might say by an evolutionary principle. But then other changes are made which can't be accounted for by a simple process of adaptation, and we're going to see that as we go on. So I'm going to use railway trains. I used to be a train spotter when I was 10 years old, so these old steam engines and so on were sort of like old friends. So excuse me my self-indulgence here. Now, the first steam-driven railway locomotive was made by a man called Richard Trevithick. He was from Cornwall, he was a Cornishman, in 1802. Now, he had previously built some kind of steam car to run on roads, and that was totally impractical. And then they already had a few wagons that they pulled with horses running on rails, and he invented the first steam locomotive to run on rails. And it operated at the Penydarren Ironworks in Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales. I've actually seen this engine, down there in Merthyr. It was a very crude machine. A steam pump turned gear wheels that in turn drove wheels on a track. Now you can see the gear wheels there, the big one there that would drive the gearings on those wheels that you can see at the back there. And the pump you can't really see is in the front, I think, and horizontal. But that would sort of push a piston, and that would move the gear, the first gear wheel, the small one, to turn the big one, and that would turn the wheels. And it was not very efficient. It doesn't look very efficient, does it? But it worked. They were able to pull coal trucks from one place to another place. It was much better than pulling them with horses or men trying to pull them. You make use of the steam, and this was a huge breakthrough. Now, in 1829, George and Robert Stephenson, George was the dad and Robert was his son, presented their rocket locomotive. I think it was done at a competition, I think in Darlington, maybe, somewhere up there in the north of England. And this rocket made use of Richard Trevithick's high-pressure boiler system. That's what made Trevithick's steam engine work. It was a high-pressure boiler. Stephenson's rocket was the first commercially successful engine for moving passengers and goods by rail long distances. In fact, I think one of the first lines, if not the first line that they were running passenger services on, was Manchester to Liverpool. So we had the beginnings of a proper railway system. And then by the 1860s, British locomotives looked more like this. Quite different from rocket, really. However, the fundamental technology was not much different from rocket. However, these locomotives were more refined and much more powerful. So you can see here it's much more compressed. They've got the pistons are inside, and you've got that big drive wheel there. You've got a proper tender at the back. You've got that steam hump. It looks like what you would think of as a steam engine, and this is by the 1860s. And by 1862, there were also steam trains running underground in London. Now that might surprise some people, that the London Underground, what was called the Metropolitan line, and that's how you get the word metro used all over the world to describe an underground railway system. They call it a metro. Well, the Metropolitan line, London was the metropolis of England, and the Metropolitan line was the first underground railway system. And what they did is they used what's called a cut and cover method. They follow along, mostly, certainly within London itself, the line of road. So you have a big road, and they took up the road, dug down, put in a railway system underneath it, covered it over. They call it cut and cover. And at certain places they would have gaps which are open to the sky to let the smoke out. Let me carry on here. The Metropolitan and District line ran through a series of tunnels. Yeah, you call these these cut and cover tunnels under the centre of London. At regular intervals, there were open sections in order to let out the smoke and steam. For passengers, this must have been quite an unpleasant experience, as the stations were filled with acrid smoke. Actually, if you go to the original, it wasn't only the Metropolitan line, the District line and the Circle line were built in similar fashion. Those are the first ones to be built. And you'll notice, if you go on the underground system, these ones are quite high. There's quite a lot of gap above the train for the tunnel compared with other tubes, as we call them, which are deeper down in the ground running through tubes. And that's because these first ones, all this steam and smoke and stuff. And some of these stations, you look at them and they are still very dirty from all that smoke and steam from the early days. Around the same time, the Metropolitan line began running trains underground in London. In the USA, they were building steam engines that looked like this. Now, I don't know about you, but I think this looks fantastic. But it's quite different from anything you would ever see on British railways. I mean, the cattle thing on the front, I think that's what it's for, the grating on the front. The bell on it and the big funnel is the major thing that's really different from anything you see on British railways, so of that period or any other period actually. And the large funnel had a special purpose for these trains, ran on wood rather than coal. Now, why was that? Well, there were extensive forests in America, in the Pacific coast, obviously, but also in the East Coast. There's a lot of places there that were heavily forested, and they were harvesting the wood for building houses and all sorts of other structures. And they must have had a lot of bits of useless wood that, just stack it up, dry it out, and use it to drive your trains. It's a very sensible thing to do. But wood produced a lot of sparks, which was a fire risk. And the funnel was designed to filter off the sparks, and it could be removed and emptied. Now, the sparks, they could cause fires in the fields around about where the train's running through, and much more so than coal-fired engines might. And also they could go into carriages and land on people's clothes and cause trouble. So they quickly learnt that they needed to filter off the sparks, so they built these big chimneys. And they had other chimney systems as well, quite elaborate things to catch the sparks or any other debris and stop them interfering with passengers and with causing fires round about. So different requirement. You could call that an adaptation, survival of the fittest, that these trains are fitter for the environment that they found themselves in America compared with the trains in Europe and certainly in Britain. Now, American locomotives carried on their own line of development. Because of the long distances involved and the need to pull large numbers of wagons or coaches, they grew in size and power. Now look how big this monster is. That's what we would call a 484. I don't think anything like that's ever been built on British Rail. They have had, I think, a 210 Evening Star. The last locomotive ever built, that class, were 210s, but they weren't as big as this. And the wheels, the drive wheels, the 10 drive wheels were small, so they're very low geared, intended for pulling trucks at a fairly slow speed. But this monster, this is designed to go intercontinental, I think, and you've got that huge tender and 2 steam humps and all those drive wheels there. This is this is typically American, actually. Over the top. And by the 1940s, some of them were enormous. Well, that was that one. Meanwhile, in 1938, the British A4 class Pacific locomotive Mallard took the world speed record for steam locomotion. Now, Pacific engines, there was lots of them. The thing is, they have a bogie at the front, which has 4 wheels. And you can see those 2 small wheels at the front, and there's 2 on the other side. So that's 4. Then you've got 6 drive wheels. You've got 3 on this side, 3 on the other. So that's 4 and 6. Then you have what's called a pony cart, which would be underneath where the driver's cab is, which is 2 wheels. So that's 462. And that 462 arrangement is called Pacific. Now, I don't know if that's because the Pacific Railways in America pioneered that. Perhaps they did. But that's what they were certainly called, and that's what they're called in Britain too. Anyway, this locomotive Mallard took the world speed record. And the record still stands today. It's 126 miles per hour. And you can actually go and see Mallard in the York Museum of of railways up in York. And sometimes I think they take, I'm not sure about this, but there are a few of these engines of this class still surviving. And I think Mallard goes out occasionally to take special interest heritage trains running up to York from London, or probably from Cambridge actually, or maybe it goes to other places too. But you know you can see these engines in action. There's all sorts of heritage lines, small ones, but there's occasionally they put these engines out with a bunch of coaches and put them on the main track, and you can go for a day out, which I must do sometime. It sounds absolute fun. Anyway, so that speed record still stands. Mallard, as I said, was a 462 Pacific locomotive and very powerful. However, it still burned coal to make steam to drive pistons and hence turn the wheels. It therefore represented only a refinement of the technology developed by Trevithick and Stephenson. So this is not a new invention. This is just an evolution of the invention of Trevithick, ultimately, as modified by Stephenson. So, you know, in a sense, you could say that this is the end of the tree of this kind of locomotive. Now, steam engines on the London Underground system were impractical on shallow lines and impossible on deep tubes. As I was saying earlier, you know, these first lines were cut and cover, and they had these open areas where the smoke and steam could go out, probably within somewhere where there was a bit of a park or something. I don't know quite where they were. But they weren't very practical, and you couldn't dig down deeper and put these through narrow tubes. They needed something else. And that something else was electric engines. As a result, in 1900, new electric engines were introduced. Invented in Germany, these were slow, noisy, and gave much vibration. So this was a new invention, from Germany that was introduced. I think they tried them in Germany on the railways. They didn't sort of prosper very much there at first, but they were ideal for the underground. And put these on there, and you haven't got all that smoke and steam. And yeah, they're a bit slow and a bit noisy, and it gave a lot of vibration, but you haven't got all that smoke and steam. So these are a great improvement on what they had before. And these electric engines did not evolve from steam engines. They represented a technological leap. I want to make that point clear. These electric engines have not evolved from Trevithick's steam engine or Stephenson's steam engine. They're something completely different. You can look at other lines of evolution for these, development of commutators and people learning about electricity. Those lines of development that put on a track, they have not evolved from the steam engine. They're something different. Yet within a very few years, electric locomotives were abandoned on the underground system. They were replaced by motorized electric carriages. These represented another technological advance. So instead of having a separate engine pulling your carriages, the carriage itself is an engine. Meanwhile, in the 1940s, America, which had large oil reserves, developed diesel-electric locomotives. The use of diesel engines to generate electricity meant there was no need for electrified overhead cables or power rails. So that's another development, completely different from what was going on in England. And the electric motors gave smooth torque and were preferable to using diesel engine power directly. That's actually something quite interesting I've noticed is that some of the what they call hybrid electric cars now, which have a petrol motor, I don't think they use diesel motors. Diesel's, you know, not considered very clean. It certainly isn't clean, and I'm glad to see its demise, to be honest. But they have the petrol engine, to charge up the battery, but what drives the car is an electric motor. So in a way, they're very similar, the technology, to these early diesel-electric locomotives that were developed in America. You are running your locomotive on electricity, which gives you a nice smooth run, the way the electric motor works, as opposed to a diesel engine. But at the same time, you're using diesel, which runs, you get diesel fuel from oil, and America had abundant oil. Actually, it's got abundant oil again now, after all the fracking and all of that new technology. So these were preferable in America to running coal-fired engines. And diesel electric engines evolved rapidly in America and was soon powering all manner of trains. They were fast, smooth, efficient, and much cheaper to maintain than old-fashioned steam engines. And that's another point. If you look on the internet, you can find some old videos, black and white videos, which were training videos originally for British Rail. I expect they've got the same thing for America. And they show you what was required for steam engines every few weeks. They had to bring the engine into the shed, and then they had to dismantle it and clean out all the pipes, the coal pipes. They had to clean out the engine, oil it all around. There's a whole lot of work. It's hugely troublesome. And then when you wanted to run your steam engine, you've got to light the fire, you've got to build the fire, get it up to temperature, and only then can you actually use your engine to drive your train. Compare that with a diesel engine, and yeah, it probably needs maintenance, maybe once, twice a year it's got to be serviced. But basically, as long as there's some diesel fuel in there, you put the key in, turn it, and it starts up. No problem. So you can see why they switched over. Much more practical. This was not a direct evolution, though. The technology driving diesel-electric trains owed much to the development of the motor car, which was by then ubiquitous. Meanwhile, in Britain in the 1920s, a network of electric suburban trains was growing. You can see that's a suburban electric kind of thing I used to see a lot of when I was a boy, with slam doors, and you can see the third rail down the middle of that left-hand line, or actually the one that's on the outside, I think. Perhaps they've got four rails here. And these trains would run usually on these third rail trains on 750 volts. But overhead ones, they had overhead gantries as well. These developed out of the underground system at first in the suburbs of London and the home counties. Well, that's where I saw them, in the suburbs of London. And electricity was picked up from either a third rail or an overhead cable. No diesel was required, so you had these, the electricity was being supplied by a power station somewhere else and transferred by big cables to the third rail, and the train would have little shoes on it which would rub along these railways and pick up the current to drive the train. Now, electric multiple units have since evolved into the Eurostar, which runs from London to Paris, Brussels and Amsterdam. You can see the overhead cables there, and those are usually at 25,000 volts, so very high voltage, and you shouldn't go near them because you get a big spark which will kill you. You don't even need to touch the thing. Don't go climbing on the things that support those cables. Don't go anywhere near them because they're very, very dangerous. But they're powerful, and they can move these trains at sort of 150 miles an hour. It's currently the fastest train to run on British railway lines, though there are faster trains of this type in Japan and China. I mean, you've heard of the bullet trains in Japan, and they've got similar things in China. Other than running on track and having passenger coaches, these trains have little in common with Stephenson's rocket. Well, actually, they've got nothing in common with rocket itself, they've got something in common with the coaches that rocket used to pull, in that you had coaches that passengers could get into, and the rocket engine would pull them. But these have got nothing in common with the actual engine itself. There's no coal there. I suppose you could say coal's being burnt in the power station to drive these things, but they could equally run off nuclear electricity or solar if there's enough of it. So these are a different technology altogether. But to say they have evolved from rockets stretches a point. Britain, this is a slight diversion here, Britain was slow to introduce diesel electric engines. In part, this was because of World War II, but it was also the case that while the country still had abundant coal reserves, it had to import oil. For a long time, in the 1950s, coal-fired engines, steam engines that is, made more economic sense. Eventually, in the late 1950s, a process of switchover began. The intention was to electrify the entire network. As an interim measure, American-style diesel-electric locomotives were introduced. This one's called Deltic. It was famous. There was the Deltic class of engines like this, diesel-electric, which were introduced to help with the changeover going from coal-fired engines to electric engines. And the change was rapid. By the mid-1960s, steam engines were extinct, except on certain heritage lines. Now, I just want to make that point. We talk about extinctions, and we're going to talk a bit more about extinctions as we go on. But the steam engines actually became extinct in Britain, or virtually extinct, in the mid-1960s. It was like that. And partly it was with these diesel-electric engines that were introduced, not only the Deltic class, but there are others as well, like the warship class, for instance, but more the introduction of diesel-electric multiple units, and also the electrification of the railways, which was a lot was done in the 60s, and it's kind of slowed down because people weren't using the railways so much. When the motorways were built, people started using the railways less and driving even more. But there is a move back towards the railways, and the electrification is going on again. So diesel-electric multiple units were also introduced on unelectrified lines. So here you've got a coach which has an electric motor in it, but also a diesel engine. And this was meant to be an interim step. However, as electrification is still incomplete in Britain, many are still in use to this day. This is especially true of small branch lines in the north of England, in Wales and in Scotland, where there's not many passengers, so the economic argument for electrification is less obvious than it is on main lines. So now I've got a tree of evolution for you for the railways. You can see all these different types of engines I've talked about put on a tree, rather similar to one that Darwin was so keen on, and that proved his, or so he thought, proved his theory of evolution. But I want to explore different parts of this first of all. So we got the evolution of the steam locomotive, and you can see there at the bottom Richard Trevithick's Penydarren Iron Works engine at the bottom there. Then you've got the Stephenson rocket, and then I put a branch. One side goes to these British engines evolving, going up to Mallard, leading to steam extinction, and the other side going up these American steam locomotives, and we got that one with the big funnel running on wood, and then you got that huge engine there. I don't know if this was the last engine built in America, probably wasn't, but that represents a type of going towards gigantism in America and going towards ultra speed in Britain. with Mallard and that big engine. And that's the evolution of steam locomotives. And in both cases, they went extinct. A bit like the dinosaurs going extinct. You had dinosaurs that were huge, like that big steam engine is huge, dominating things, like a great big brontosaurus or Tyrannosaurus Rex or something. And then you've got others which are very fleet of foot, like Mallard. Not as big, but it's very quick. But both go extinct. They go extinct. Why? Because they're not the fittest. And then we got the evolution here of the electric trains that we have today. I've put a little, Stephenson's rocket, I've left them there, but they're not really coming from that, which is why I've left a bit of a gap there in that branch leading out to the first, that German engine on the underground leading up to multiple units and development of those leading up to the Eurostar at the top there. And also a branch going out towards that diesel-electric hybrid. And then I've got the American system developing in a different direction with the diesel-electrics, diesel-electric locomotives, diesel-electric trains there being pulled. And then how the technology passed across back to Britain with Deltic, the diesel-electric locomotive of American type being introduced onto British rail as an interim before leading to the diesel-electric hybrids. Actually, there are still some of those, I think, those diesel-electric engines still running on the railway system now. And there certainly are purely electric locomotives as well running, which for pulling goods trains particularly. So you can see we've got different branches of evolution here. And so I've shown that back on this original diagram, we can clearly see separate lines of evolution in the story of railway trains. There's even an extinction event in the case of steam engines. Yeah, they go extinct, like the dinosaur. But we can still see electric multiple units, but they represent an entirely different line of evolution. It's quite false to say that they've come from Stephenson's rocket and evolved willy-nilly. They're not. They're separate ideas that people have had and created. And the same thing with the diesel-electric engines in America. Separate ideas. Yes, they had different conditions. They got plenty of oil, plenty of diesel, so why not use it? Why not make trains that run on that instead of coal? Makes sense, doesn't it? Can you really say they've evolved from steam engines? No, they haven't. There was something new there. However, we know that there is no life principle being evolved in the case of trains. Engines and the means of propulsion are developed by engineers. They do not mutate from one to another. And I want to make that clear. This idea of this spontaneous mutation that Darwin thought, and he thought he was so clever for thinking that up. Why? How do you get the first animal that has an eyeball? How do you get the first animal that has a liver or a heart? How do you get the first plant that produces a flower? These things are actually new ideas and inventions. You wouldn't get a plant with a flower if there wasn't some knowledge somewhere, some consciousness that there's such things as insects, and that insects could be used to come to your flower to pollinate it. Think about that. I mean, how would you evolve something just to turn into a plant that has a flower? Yeah, you can see that the plant with the flower is more advanced than a fern, say. But you would not go down that line of evolution by chance. Why would you? Why would anything? There has to be something that is aware that this is a good idea because there is something called an insect which has wings and flies around and can go to your plant and pollinate it. It takes intelligence to do that. And just the same thing as in America, why would you stop building coal-fired steam engines? Because you know you've got lots of oil, and from that oil you've got diesel, and it's cheap. And so you make engines that run with diesel instead of coal, because coal's got to be dug out of the ground by coal miners, and they cost money. Cheaper to get oil and run them on oil. Makes sense, doesn't it? Economic sense. And that's a lot of what drives things. But it takes engineers with intelligence to have thought of that and to have done something about it. Just as you have Elon Musk running his SpaceX company, and they look at the peculiar rockets that some of the other people send up, which you launch it once and then it's dumped. You spent millions of pounds or dollars, hundreds of millions, maybe $1 billion sometimes on building this rocket, and you use it once. It's crazy. So what does he do? He develops another rocket. I'm not talking about the big ones they're making now, but his earlier rockets, the Falcon 9, I think they're called. And these ones, they go up in the air, and then you see the booster, and it comes back and it lands. They land the boosters, and they do it over and over again. It's like watching a 747. You wouldn't fly a 747 to Australia and say, right, everybody put your parachutes on now, jump out because this is going into the sea. You wouldn't do that, would you? You want to land it. And it's the same now with rockets. They've changed the game by having rockets that can land. And it was the same in America when they changed the game. They said, oh, we don't want to run on coal, we want to run on diesel. And it was the same in London when they say, oh, we don't like all this dust and dirt in the underground. It makes our clothes dirty and it's horrible. And someone else says, well, we've got electric engines in Germany, let's try one of those. So they try that, and then they say, well, we don't really need to have a separate engine. Let's put it into the carriage, and we'll have several of them in the train itself, and it'll run smoother. And that's what they do. We still do it. You go to the underground. Actually, the underground today is not so very different as it was from maybe 1920s. And any metro system that you go to is the same basic technology as then. So these things develop, but they don't just happen. They happen in response. And the change is done deliberately in response, not accidentally. And that's the point I'm wanting to make here. So, could it be the same with so-called Darwinian evolution? Is it true that all of life has evolved from simple organism through chance alone? And I put it to you, can all of what we see in life today be the result of one simple organism being modified by adaptations, spontaneous adaptations? Or have there been other interventions, creative interventions, where intelligence has intervened and put something new there, just like putting an electric engine into an underground train or a diesel engine into an American train to make better use of the situation and resources, moving away from the technology that was implicit in the one-celled organism and how that evolved. Now let's just take a look at the fossil record, because this is what is the thing that's looked at most by Darwinians as justification for his ideas. So leaving railways, the fossil record indicates that the flora and fauna of planet Earth has changed massively over time. And you can see that at the bottom, you've got these very simple creatures and gradually get more complicated. And you come up, you've got lizards, and you've got dinosaurs, and then they go extinct. And you've got more dinosaurs, and they go extinct. And you've got big mammals, and some of them go extinct, like mammoths. And you end up with what we've got today, and you've got the human race at the top there in the Quaternary period. All these are given period names, usually from places where the fossils are found. So you've got Cambrian, or Cambria is the Latin name for Wales. So they were, first of all, researching these things in Wales. And Ordovician The Ordovici's tribe was a tribe that lived in North Wales, and so the Ordovician is in North Wales. To find those things, the Siluries lived in South Wales, so they found a different type of things there, which they believe come a bit later. And then you've got Devonian. Well, Devon is another county in England. So you can see all this is going on in England and well, Britain to start with. And then you've got Mississippian, right? Well, that must come from the Mississippi. And then you've got the Pennsylvanian and the Permian. I don't know where Permian is. The Triassic, the Jurassic. I guess that's Jura Mountain somewhere, where they're finding these big dinosaurs. Cretaceous, not sure where that is. And then you've got the Tertiary and the Quaternary. Tertiary must mean the third. Quaternary, the fourth. I don't know what the first two were, presumably two earlier major periods or something. I don't know. Anyway, you've got all those different ages, and they've worked out a timetable for them, going back to, what was it, 650 million years, is it? Right back to the earliest creatures. So they reckon all this happens spontaneously over time. Give it enough time, enough changes happen spontaneously. Bit of competition, survival of the fittest. And Bob's your uncle, there you are, you've got man walking on top. And it divides into ages during which certain species appeared and others went extinct. The assumption is that evolution is a continuous process, with the seeds of new species emerging before other species go extinct. However, there are serious problems with this assumption. It is clearly not the case. And if we look down at the bottom of the table, we see the Cambrian layer. I mentioned to you Cambria is the Latin name for Wales. And in this Cambrian layer, it looks innocuous, but in fact, during this time, which is now reckoned to be only some 10 million years in duration, there's an explosion of not just species, but whole orders of different life forms. This is a massive, massive change at that time. These included the first creatures with spinal cords, the first fish, and the first mollusks. There was a sudden and huge diversity, with nothing in the Precambrian layer representing transitional forms. Now that's another important point. You know, you're saying that you're having these things happening little bit by little bit, stage by stage, tiny changes here and there, just giving an edge. But you should expect to find the fossils of all those different tiny slight differences, or at least some of them, showing intervening species. It's like the missing link. You know, they've always been looking for the missing link between humans and apes. Yeah, and apes and monkeys, I think, as well. And they can't find it. They can't find the missing link. It seems to have happened as a major change somehow, that humans and apes are, not the same. Yeah, there's a lot they have in common, but they're different, and you can't find the halfway stage, as it were, between them. So this is the equivalent of steam engines, diesels and electric engines and trains appearing all at once and together on the railways. I want to make that point. When you have this sudden change, suddenly you've got all these things with spinal cords, you've suddenly got fish, you've got things that have eyes, you've got some mollusks happening, and major changes, each one of which is going to develop further into different categories further down the line. It's like you had your steam engines, your electric engines, your diesel engines all come at once on the railway, which is suddenly there. Or maybe what was there before was just a few carts being pulled by horses on wooden rails, and suddenly you've gone to a railway system that's got some steel rails, it's got steam engines, it's got electric engines, it's got diesel engines, all doing their own thing at once. Where's the transition? But Darwin himself recognised that this was a serious challenge to his theory. Well, he might. He answered this by saying that in the fullness of time, transitional species would be discovered in the fossil record. However, this has not happened. The sudden appearance of these species seems to have happened in diverse places all at once. These include Wales, which is Cambria, the USA and China. Transitional forms have not been found. And, people have been searching for this for the best part of 150 years now, and they still haven't found them. And they've been looking everywhere. There is also the question of sudden DNA complexity to contend with. The development of formations such as eyes, spinal cords and skeletons require complex DNA coding, not present in the life forms of pre-Cambrian layers. I want to make that point, that the coding, Darwin didn't know anything about DNA coding. As far as he was concerned, single cells were very, very simple. All you had was a nucleus and a surrounding jelly and a skin, and that's your cell. We now know they're immensely complicated. Even a simple single cell is immensely complicated. And how that comes out of something that wasn't alive in the first place is a major challenge, and nobody can answer it. If they could, they would probably make one in the laboratory, but they can't. So there have been many extinction events in Earth's history. I'm looking at extinctions now. And the red lines, I've drawn red lines on here to represent the 5 most serious of these. And here they are listed. All of these mass extinctions represent the disappearance of at least 70% of all life forms. You've got the Ordovician, 85% of life forms died off at the end of the Ordovician. The Devonian, 70% died off. The Permian, 95% of everything alive died in the Permian extinction. The Triassic, 76%. And the KT, the Cretaceous Tertiary, 80% died. So the most serious of these was the Permian extinction, which is thought to have taken place some 25 million years ago. This accounted for the disappearance of 95% of all life forms. The KT, Cretaceous to Tertiary extinction, the one that eliminated the dinosaurs, is thought to have taken place 65 million years ago. How they arrive at these dates, I'm not certain. I would think they probably need to be taken with a pinch of salt, but we'll go with it for now because we don't know better. These 5 extinctions are usually viewed as resulting from cataclysmic events, asteroid impacts, volcanism and the like. So there you can see again on the overall diagram the 5 red lines, which are the major extinctions, ending up with the one that killed off the dinosaurs between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary. However, what if that's the extinctions, were directed by some kind of cosmic intelligence that wanted to clear the Earth in preparation for something new? I don't know about you, but when I'm gardening, and I do quite a lot of gardening, if I've got a bed that's got a lot of weeds in it, first thing I do is get rid of the weeds. Either by smothering them, you might do that if you've got the time, cover them over with something like carpet or black plastic and smother them so no light's getting there and the weeds die off. It's a good way of doing it, actually. Or you might spray them with something that's going to kill them off immediately. Some Roundup or something like that. Or you might laboriously dig them out. Doesn't always get all the seeds, but you get out the big ones anyway. Pull them out. And you might do that if you're in a hurry. Or you're feeling energetic. But you clear the weeds first before you plant something different. Now, what about looking at the Earth as being a flower garden? And you've got all these other things, on it, which are taking up space, like dinosaurs. You've got all these dinosaurs roaming around in packs, eating everything, leaving huge piles of dung, chasing each other and gobbling each other up. And you want to introduce something more refined. Let's call it mammals. You don't really want to have your mammals gobbled up by Tyrannosaurus Rex, do you? You want them to be given a chance to develop. So what do? You clear away all the dinosaurs, get rid of those first. They're the weeds. They might survive in a few places for a while. But it's like taking all the steam engines off the railway line so you can put your diesels and electrics on there. You don't want to have you want to get rid of those steam engines, because they're in the way now. They were great in their day, but now they're in the way. So perhaps that's kind of how the Earth is treated by, let's call it, higher intelligence. And that's why we have extinctions. I'd put that to you. What if the evolution of life forms on Earth reflects a plan of gradual terraforming and experimentation of different species? Sorry, I should have put that on so you could see it. I tend to think that when you look at the Bible, yes, I know, how dare he talk about the Bible, the creationism and all of that. I'm not going to go talk to you about creationism, certainly not in the terminology that your hackles are raised by. But when you look at the first chapter of Genesis, and it talks about the creation of the earth and life on earth, it sounds, if you, instead of looking at, no, I don't believe God's doing this in 7 days, right? Let's get that clear. But 7 days could be symbolic of 7 periods, 7 stages that you're doing something. But look at it that way, and these stages don't necessarily have to be, well, certainly not a day, don't have to be 1,000 years, it could be millions of years, I don't know. But stages. And when you look at it that way, we're told at the beginning of that Genesis that the earth is already there, but it's dark. And then it goes through whole ideas of things being developed, making light, separating the waters above from the waters below, putting different plants on them, and then animals, and then finally man. It sounds like terraforming, somewhat like perhaps Elon Musk and his friends plan to do on Mars. Yeah, Mars is a desert at the moment. It's a very, very cold desert with very thin air that you can't breathe. Frankly, I'm not sure I would really want to go there. I think it's fascinating, and I'd love to see the footage when they've been there and filmed it all. It's going to make great TV. But it's not somewhere I want to go particularly. I'm too old anyway. But what if that is what happened with the Earth, that it's terraformed? I'm not saying who terraformed. I'm not saying E.T. came here and terraformed it. I'm just putting that to you, that it's been terraformed. So what if the eventual plan was the development of a creature that was both able to live within the Earth's biosphere, eating its food and breathing its air, but also carrying intelligence? In other words, what if the advent of mankind was planned all along? Well, if you look on that diagram, there we are, man, cock of the roost, right at the top there. All the other stuff that's gone before, that's gone extinct. There's plenty of stuff that's not extinct. There's plenty of plants, there's plenty of animals, there's plenty of mosquitoes, all sorts of things here that haven't gone extinct. And we have a complex biosystem. But what if the plan of it was, in fact, to develop a creature that could hold, or could be intelligent enough to be creative in its own right, to invent steam engines and to invent diesel engines and electric engines, and to invent rocket ships that can re-land and others that could maybe get to Mars. What if that was the plan all along? I put it to you, it makes more sense to me than the idea that one thing leads to another and by accident turns into another, and over millions of years we just end up with man. That makes no sense to me at all. And we know that our galaxy, the Milky Way, is spiral in form, like a giant Catherine wheel. Here, I can see it there. Well, it's not actually the Milky Way, it's another galaxy, but it's like that. We know that. It has a diameter of 100,000 light years. Well, that's a very long way, right? Light travels at a speed of 186,000 miles per second. So think of how many seconds there are in a year and how far light is going to travel within that period of time, and you've got a light year. Now multiply that by 100,000 and you've got the rough diameter of the Milky Way. So it's big, very big. And till recently, it was thought by astronomers that the Sun was more or less unique in having planets, right? So until very recently, certainly when, I think maybe 30 years ago, they assumed that it's a very unusual thing to have planets. Our Sun has got these planets, but we didn't know of any other star that had planets. We now know that most, if not all, stars do. If only 1 in 100 has an Earth-type planet, that would still mean there are a billion, and that's just in this galaxy. I mean, that's a staggering thought, isn't it? So Darwin lived at a time when people did not know that the Milky Way itself is just one galaxy among billions. He also did not know about DNA coding, or just how complicated is even a single-cell animal. He assumed that the Earth was unique and that life had formed here by chance. After that, it had simply evolved by chance, aided by survival of the fittest. In the context of the universe as we know it today, this is naive thinking. So what is a more plausible theory? Well, that's what I'm going to talk to you about in the next lecture in this little series of 3. And we'll look into that, and I'll try to put my first thoughts. No, it won't be a comprehensive theory, but it will be moving in that direction of a different theory for how life came about on this planet and why. And so I hope you enjoyed this lecture and that you will be with me on the next. If you haven't already subscribed to this channel, I would ask you to. I'm also going to be launching a Patreon channel, and I shall put details on that on my YouTube channel for those of you who wish to help support this work, how you can do so. I don't receive anything from YouTube for doing this. This is all done purely voluntarily, and I hope it's helping you and that you are enjoying my lectures. But it does need some support. I have to buy new equipment from time to time, and it's difficult for me to carry on with these lectures without some kind of help from people who want to be patrons. So I'm going to put the links there, and I hope you will respond. And I should add that I'm also going to restart the Invisible College, which will have a membership through Patreon, and I hope you will come and join that, and that we'll be able to have discussions through the Invisible College as well. So thank you for your time and your interest, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.